Welcome back to Corporate Digital Sovereignty, our five-part exploration of how tech giants are quietly reinventing money. I'm Kaede, and this is episode 2 of our series examining what happens when corporations don't just process payments, but actually create currencies. Last time, we introduced Horizon Coin as our case study of corporate currency and explored its fundamental design and adoption strategy. Today, we're scaling up to examine something even more intriguing: what happens when corporate currencies begin outcompeting national ones? It's essentially a financial cage match between central banks that took centuries to develop and tech platforms built in a decade. And the odds might not favor the institutions with the impressive marble buildings. Throughout monetary history, competition between currencies usually involved neighboring nations or precious metals, situations with natural geographic and physical constraints. But digital corporate currencies operate with fundamentally different rules. They move at network speed rather than physical distribution speeds. They cross borders with a few lines of code rather than armored trucks. And they're backed by user trust in tech platforms rather than government promises. When Ecuador officially adopted the US dollar in 2000 after its banking crisis, it required months of physical currency distribution. A digital equivalent could happen in days or even hours. Money has always been about trust, but now we're witnessing a competition to determine whose promises people trust more: governments or tech companies. And surprisingly often, people seem to trust the folks who make their phones more than the folks who fill their potholes. In this episode, we'll examine what happens when people in countries with unstable currencies gain access to corporate alternatives that offer better stability, lower transaction costs, and integrated services unavailable through traditional financial systems. We'll explore historical parallels of currency substitution, introduce our detailed case study of Maria, a small business owner navigating this choice, and unpack the often invisible incentives that shape these decisions. By viewing these dynamics through both academic research and practical real-world scenarios, we'll explore how this competition might fundamentally restructure economic relationships between citizens, corporations, and governments, often with neither consent nor comprehension from the general public. After all, nobody ever ran a political campaign on the slogan, "Vote for me. I'll protect our monetary sovereignty from tech platforms." But perhaps they should start. To understand the potential impact of corporate currencies, we need to examine historical parallels of currency substitution, situations where people abandon their national currency for a more stable alternative. Economists call this process dollarization because it often involves adopting the US dollar, but the pattern transcends any specific currency. Formal dollarization occurs when countries officially abandon their currency, as Ecuador did in 2000 after inflation reached 96%. Informal dollarization happens when citizens spontaneously adopt foreign currencies for transactions and savings, despite government preferences, as seen in Argentina, Venezuela, and Zimbabwe during periods of economic instability. These historical cases provide crucial insights into what might happen with digital alternatives, except with fewer suitcases full of cash and more QR codes. The substitution process typically follows predictable stages. It begins with store-of-value substitution, where people save in stable alternatives while still transacting in local currency. Progresses to unit-of-account substitution, where prices are quoted in the alternative currency. And culminates in medium-of-exchange substitution, where daily transactions occur in the alternative currency. What's fascinating about digital alternatives is how they might compress or rearrange these traditional stages, potentially beginning with transactions rather than savings due to convenience factors. When Venezuela experienced hyperinflation, people stored wealth in dollars but couldn't easily transact with them. With digital alternatives, both functions could shift simultaneously, accelerating the substitution process dramatically. The historical playbook for currency collapse might need updating for the digital age. Things happen much faster when you don't need to count physical bills. Historical patterns reveal economic trade-offs central to currency substitution. Nations gain stability and reduced transaction costs, but lose monetary policy independence, seigniorage revenue, and lender of last resort capabilities. Citizens gain purchasing power protection and reduced inflation, but face external economic cycles and potential financial exclusion. What differs with corporate currencies isn't the fundamental economics, but the governance structure. When citizens adopt the US dollar, they're choosing a currency governed by the Federal Reserve with public accountability mechanisms. When they adopt Horizon Coin, they're choosing a currency governed by shareholder interests and terms of service agreements. The economic benefits might be similar, but the accountability structures couldn't be more different. It's like choosing between a democratically elected landlord with term limits and one who can change the rules whenever quarterly projections look disappointing. To understand how this plays out in practice, let's meet Maria, a small business owner in a country experiencing 20% annual inflation, a fictional character navigating very real economic dynamics. Maria runs a successful cafe with 15 employees, managing inventory, payroll, and finances through increasingly challenging monetary conditions. Her primary problems include revenue cost mismatches, where supplies must be paid for immediately, but customer payments come later, creating negative cash flow during inflation. Savings deterioration, where retained earnings lose value while sitting in bank accounts. And volatile planning horizons that make expansion or investment nearly impossible. She's a capable business owner facing systematic monetary problems beyond her control, as millions of real entrepreneurs do across dozens of countries. Maria's not looking for a monetary policy seminar. She just wants her business to survive without spending half her day calculating inflation. Maria's conventional options each carry significant drawbacks. She could raise prices frequently to match inflation, but this creates menu costs, customer resistance, and competitive disadvantages. She could convert cash to foreign currency, but this involves exchange controls, high conversion fees, and potential legal complications. She could take on debt as an inflation hedge, but high interest rates and repayment risks make this prohibitive. Or she could reduce operations to minimize currency exposure, directly limiting her business potential. These are the classic, deeply unsatisfying options available in inflationary environments, all involving significant trade-offs with no optimal solution. It's like being asked to choose between a root canal, an IRS audit, a DMV line, or an expired milk drinking contest. The question isn't which option is good, but which one is least terrible. When Horizon Coin enters Maria's market, it offers solutions specifically designed for her problems. A stable value currency accessed through the platform she already uses for customer orders, inventory management tools with inflation-protected pricing, and working capital loans denominated in Horizon Coin at just 5% interest. This creates compelling immediate advantages. Transaction stability eliminates daily recalculations, integrated financial services reduce administrative overhead, and the inflation protection alone saves substantially compared to local currency. For Maria, this isn't about monetary theory or corporate sovereignty. It's about pragmatic business survival through tools that solve her immediate problems. Horizon isn't selling her a currency. They're selling her business continuity in an impossible situation. And when faced with certain failure or potential dependence, most rational business owners choose dependence every time. When Maria adopts Horizon Coin, she becomes part of what economists might call a substitution cascade, a self-reinforcing cycle where initial adoption triggers further adoption through network effects. As she begins accepting Horizon Coin, her suppliers gain incentives to also accept it to simplify transactions with her business. As her employees request partial salary payments in stable currency, their landlords and service providers gain incentives to accept it. Each adoption decision creates ripple effects that incentivize further adoption, a process that can accelerate with surprising speed once initial resistance is overcome. Currency adoption has always been driven by network effects. The more people who use something as money, the more useful it becomes as money. Digital currencies just add rocket fuel to this inherently exponential process. This cascading adoption produces measurable economic benefits through reduced transaction costs, compared to traditional currency exchange, increased economic certainty, allowing longer-term contracts and investments, and productivity improvements from resources no longer allocated to inflation management. The quantifiable advantages include currency stability that preserves purchasing power, lower effective interest rates due to reduced risk premiums, and transaction simplification across previously separate systems. When evaluated purely in economic efficiency terms, the shift makes perfect rational sense. It's the governance implications that raise concerns beyond immediate financial calculations. Just as few people contemplated social media's effects on democracy when signing up for convenient photo sharing, few users consider monetary governance when adopting convenient payment systems. As adoption spreads through Maria's economic community, a parallel system emerges, what economists call partial dollarization, but with corporate currency instead. This creates dual monetary systems operating simultaneously: the national currency governed by central bank policies and Horizon coin governed by corporate algorithms. The transition moves through progressive phases. First, optional acceptance, where businesses accept both currencies, then preferential treatment with better terms for Horizon coin users, and finally functional replacement, where the corporate currency becomes the de facto standard for certain transaction types. Throughout this process, individual rational choices create collective monetary shifts without explicit societal decisions. No votes, no legislation, just millions of pragmatic choices accumulating into systemic transformation. Democracy works through ballots, markets work through wallets, and the wallets are often faster. Academic research provides crucial context for understanding currency competition, though much of it was developed before digital alternatives existed. In their classic 1976 paper, Currency Competition and the Transition to Monetary Union, Nobel laureates Robert Mundell and Milton Friedman established that citizens will choose currencies offering better value preservation over inflationary alternatives when given free choice. More recent research confirms that substitution rates accelerate dramatically when inflation exceeds certain thresholds, typically 20–30% annually. However, digital currencies operate under different constraints than the physical currencies these models were built around: constraints of network rather than physical distribution, making adoption potentially much faster than historical precedents would suggest. It's like comparing how quickly news traveled by telegraph versus by Twitter, the same basic function with radically different timeframes. Current research on digital currency adoption emphasizes distinct dynamics from traditional substitution. Lower switching costs once digital infrastructure exists, integrated service benefits beyond simple currency functions, and surveillance capitalism incentives not present in traditional monetary competition. The business model implications highlight how corporate currencies generate value differently than national ones, combining seigniorage, profit from creating money, transaction fees, merchant services revenue, and most importantly, behavioral data value that traditional currencies never captured. This creates fundamentally different incentive structures around currency management and privacy, with corporate currencies designed to maximize engagement, data collection, and ecosystem control rather than traditional macroeconomic objectives. When your currency is designed by people whose performance reviews depend on engagement metrics rather than inflation targets, you get fundamentally different priorities built into the system. Emerging research specifically examining corporate digital currencies identifies governance concerns largely absent from traditional monetary discussions. Private rulemaking without democratic input, terms of service functioning as de facto regulation, and algorithmic governance determining economic access. The research highlights how monetary substitution traditionally occurs between systems with similar governance structures, one central bank for another, while corporate currencies introduce fundamentally different accountability mechanisms and optimization goals. This creates not just economic but political economic disruption, transitioning certain governance functions from public institutions to private platforms. a shift occurring through market mechanisms rather than democratic processes. Academic papers tend to use terms like governance externalities and accountability deficits. But in plain language, they're documenting how financial decisions made in corporate boardrooms increasingly affect millions without corresponding representation. Horizon's expansion strategy for targeting inflation-prone markets reveals sophisticated understanding of both economic and psychological factors driving currency adoption. Their market selection criteria prioritize economies with specific characteristics, inflation rates exceeding 15% annually to create genuine need, digital payment penetration above 40% to ensure necessary infrastructure, and smartphone adoption exceeding 60% to enable rapid scaling. This creates a precise targeting model focused on maximum adoption potential with minimum resistance, essentially identifying markets where their solution solves urgent problems for digitally capable populations. Like any good business, they're not trying to serve everyone. They're looking for the perfect overlap of desperate need and digital readiness. Their market entry approach combines business service introduction with consumer adoption incentives, establishing merchant networks through payment processing advantages, implementing platform integration through commerce and logistics solutions, and creating consumer incentives through stability benefits and reward structures. The implementation sequence strategically targets business users first, creating commercial utility before pursuing consumer adoption, and focuses initial efforts in commercial centers before expanding to secondary markets. This approach smartly recognizes that currency adoption follows commercial necessity rather than consumer preference. Money goes where it's accepted, not necessarily where it's theoretically superior. While economic textbooks discuss store of value and medium of exchange functions, Horizon understands something simpler. People use what works where they shop. Their engagement strategy effectively addresses psychological barriers to adoption through education programs, explaining Horizon coin benefits in practical terms, streamlined onboarding processes that minimize perceived complexity, and incremental adoption paths allowing users to gradually increase usage. The incentive structures specifically target inflation pain points with stability guarantees, reward programs weighted toward essential purchases, and savings features offering returns impossible with local currencies. Most importantly, they frame the entire process around solving practical problems rather than replacing national currencies, positioning Horizon Coin as a supplemental tool rather than a currency competitor, regardless of its actual function. This creates what psychologists call preference falsification, where people adopt a system for its practical benefits while maintaining theoretical loyalty to national currency. No one has to admit they're abandoning their national currency. They're just using a convenient digital tool that happens to do everything a currency does. Regulatory responses to corporate currency adoption follow surprisingly predictable patterns across different jurisdictions, though the effectiveness varies dramatically. The initial reaction typically involves assertion of monetary authority through public statements reaffirming central bank primacy, legal clarifications regarding tender status, and sometimes outright prohibition attempts. These efforts generally prove ineffective when addressing actual consumer needs, as Zimbabwe demonstrated when banning foreign currencies in 2019, only to reverse course 10 months later when economic reality prevailed. Prohibition works poorly against solutions addressing genuine problems, something regulators consistently underestimate until markets teach them otherwise. The second phase involves attempted competition through digitization of national currencies, improved central bank services, and modernized payment infrastructures. These efforts demonstrate how corporate currency competition often drives beneficial innovation in public systems, creating what economists call institutional competition, where public services improve under pressure from private alternatives. However, these initiatives face substantial constraints. Legacy systems limiting technical capabilities, bureaucratic processes reducing agility, and political oversight creating implementation delays. When central banks attempt to compete directly with tech platforms on user experience and innovation speed, they often find themselves in an uneven contest. They're bringing regulation books to a code fight. The final phase typically involves pragmatic accommodation through regulatory frameworks incorporating new realities, hybrid systems allowing controlled integration, and adjusted policies recognizing dual currency operations. The most effective approaches focus on systemic risk management rather than institutional protection, establishing reporting requirements ensuring visibility, maintaining financial system access regardless of currency choice, and creating proportional regulations based on actual risks rather than institutional preservation. This creates compromises where corporate currencies operate under appropriate oversight without triggering destructive prohibition or surrendering monetary governance entirely. Like most technology-driven disruptions, the endpoint isn't replacement but reconfiguration, with effectiveness determined by how quickly regulators adapt to inevitable change rather than how strongly they resist it. To understand how these economic shifts affect daily life, consider Scenario 1, the divergent access economy, where technological access increasingly determines financial opportunity. Two small business owners in the same city face dramatically different realities. Alejandro, with digital access and platform familiarity, operates seamlessly in the Horizon ecosystem, accessing stable currency, favorable loans, and integrated services. Carmen, without digital literacy or qualifying metrics, faces escalating challenges as suppliers, customers, and employees increasingly prefer Horizon coin transactions she cannot process. This scenario highlights how technology-based financial access creates new forms of exclusion, not based on traditional factors like wealth or location, but on digital incorporation. Income inequality has existed for centuries, but what we're witnessing is potential access inequality operating on different principles. Scenario 2, the algorithmic stability trade-off, examines governance transitions. Regional businesses benefit from Horizon Coin's algorithmic stability during political uncertainty, continuing operations when national currency fluctuates wildly during elections. However, when policy violations occur, businesses discover that terms of service enforcement effectively functions as monetary policy without appeals processes or representative input. This illustrates how protection from one type of volatility creates exposure to another, trading political risk for corporate governance risk. The trade isn't inherently negative, but it occurs without explicit acknowledgement of the governance implications, as immediate economic benefits overshadow longer-term accountability questions. The political volatility makes headlines. The corporate governance shift happens in unread terms of service updates. Scenario 3, the monetary policy dilution explores systemic effects. As 40% of economic activity shifts to Horizon Coin, central bank interest rate adjustments increasingly affect only portions of the economy. Fiscal stimulus payments in national currency generate less economic impact as recipients quickly convert to Horizon Coin for stability. National economic management tools increasingly affect shrinking portions of the economic system. This demonstrates how individual rational choices collectively reduce policy effectiveness through what economists call monetary sovereignty dilution, where central bank tools influence progressively smaller portions of the economy. Nobody debates monetary sovereignty at grocery checkouts, but individual payment choices collectively determine its practical reality. Modern monetary theory works great until people start voting with their digital wallets. The emergence of digital economic zones represents perhaps the most fascinating potential development, creating economic spaces defined by platform governance rather than geography. Traditional economic zones exist in physical locations with special regulatory treatment. Digital economic zones exist wherever platform rules apply, regardless of physical location. This creates novel jurisdictional questions. When transactions occur in Horizon Coin between users in different countries through servers in a third country, which regulatory framework applies? The precedents suggest unclear answers, as digital commerce increasingly operates between regulatory systems rather than cleanly within them. Geography has historically defined economic jurisdiction, but digital transactions don't respect those boundaries, creating regulatory gaps where platform governance fills the vacuum. The characteristics of digital economic zones include protocol-defined rules determining transaction validity, algorithmic governance replacing human discretionary judgment, and cross-border consistency, regardless of physical location. Unlike traditional regulations varying by jurisdiction, platform protocols create uniform rule systems applying consistently wherever the platform operates, effectively establishing transnational economic rule systems through technology rather than treaties. This creates unofficial regulatory harmonization driven by platform convenience rather than governmental coordination, potentially beneficial for transaction efficiency, but problematic for democratic accountability. Treaty negotiations take years and require legislative approval. Platform terms of service updates happen overnight with a click-through agreement. The implications extend beyond specific currencies to broader questions about economic governance in digital environments. Where code increasingly functions as law, private infrastructure mediates essential transactions, and algorithms determine economic inclusion or exclusion. The most significant potential development involves platform-based economic integration, occurring faster than governmental treaty-based integration, creating de facto common markets through technology before political processes can establish appropriate oversight mechanisms. This represents jurisdiction arbitrage at unprecedented scale, where economic activities migrate to governance systems optimized for commercial efficiency rather than public accountability. We've seen this pattern before with corporations shopping for favorable tax jurisdictions. Now the jurisdictions themselves are becoming digital, mobile, and increasingly independent from geographic constraints. As we conclude our second episode, let's extract key insights from our exploration of currency competition. First, understand that corporate currencies succeed primarily by solving real problems that traditional financial systems have failed to address. In unstable economies, platforms aren't winning through marketing, but by providing genuine stability, reduced transaction costs, and integrated services unavailable through conventional banking. The challenge isn't just competing currencies, but competing economic systems with fundamentally different capabilities. Maria's choice isn't between currencies, but between financial futures with drastically different practical implications. Second, recognize that adoption decisions occur through immediate practical considerations rather than governance evaluation. When businesses and individuals face inflation eroding 20% of value annually, theoretical concerns about monetary sovereignty become abstract compared to concrete survival challenges. The choice architecture systematically emphasizes immediate benefits while obscuring governance implications, not through deception, but through natural attention economics, where urgent problems overshadow distant considerations. Most significantly, these individual practical decisions collectively create systemic shifts without corresponding collective decisions about governance. Finally, understand that effective responses require addressing underlying needs rather than merely asserting authority. The most successful regulatory approaches focus on the problems driving adoption, creating stable alternatives, reducing transaction costs, and modernizing financial services, rather than simply prohibiting corporate currencies. Digital adoption moves too quickly and addresses too many genuine needs for prohibition to succeed alone. The future will likely involve hybrid systems where traditional and corporate currencies coexist under frameworks balancing innovation and governance, requiring creativity beyond traditional monetary policy, thinking to establish appropriate oversight without sacrificing beneficial innovation. In our next episode, we'll explore how corporate currencies are transforming data economics, examining how financial information reveals patterns of daily life impossible to capture through other means. We'll investigate the behavioral capital model, where user attention and financial data become more valuable than traditional transaction fees, explore the profile enrichment dynamic, where payment information completes behavioral models, and consider the predictive finance framework, where patterns become products. And we'll do all this while respecting your intelligence enough not to pretend there's a simple, just don't use it solution to these complex challenges. We'll analyze a detailed scenario examining David, whose spending patterns generate behavioral predictions more accurate than his own self-understanding. Predictive marketing that seems mysteriously relevant, credit scores based on associations rather than behaviors, and financial products designed for vulnerabilities only his data reveals. This isn't speculative futurism. It's already happening through existing payment data, just not yet at the scale or integration level that corporate currencies would enable. As financial information merges with platform data, the emerging insights create unprecedented visibility into daily life, transforming currency from a medium of exchange into a medium of observation. As you consider these developments, watch for transition indicators in your own financial experiences. Personalization that seems uncannily accurate, financial offers timed to life transitions you haven't announced, and pricing differentiation that varies mysteriously between individuals. The companies merging payment and lifestyle data aren't engaging in science fiction. They're combining information streams already available into unified perspectives previously impossible. Next time your phone shows ads for products you merely considered purchasing, or offers financial services precisely when you need them, remember you're witnessing early versions of the systems we'll explore in our next conversation. Before we conclude, I want to sincerely thank each of you for joining us for this second episode of our 5-part series. Your engagement with these complex topics matters, because understanding the changing relationship between technology, money, and daily life is the first step toward ensuring these innovations serve human priorities rather than merely corporate ones. Until next time, I'm Kaede, reminding you that in the competition between corporate and national currencies, the most important question isn't which will win, but who gets to write the rules for either.